Dublin, 1853. A new production of Bellini's I Puritani is being performed by the quartet who sang at the opera's premiere in Paris in 1835 and in countless productions in London ever since. The soprano Giulia Grisi and bass Luigi Lablache, the tenor Giovanni Battista Rubini, and the baritone Antonio Tamburini. They wear their usual costumes and makeup. Curiously, however, their stature has shrunk to only 15 inches tall, and their fleshly substance has solidified into wood. This is a puppet show, a recreation of the opera as sung by its original cast, a forerunner of our modern tribute bands imitating the music of the Beatles or the Bee Gees for nostalgic audiences or those who never heard them live. In our 19th century case, life through voice was breathed into the miniaturized, rigid bodies of the cast by a quartet of amateur but exceptional singers. Lablache was now voiced by John Stanford, a lawyer whose powerful instrument had been schooled in Paris and Italy in his youth, and whose infant son would become the composer, Sir Charles Villiers Stanford. Less orthodox, as noted by the musical world, was the substitution for Rubini. Mrs. Josephine Giel was the Arturo. And as you will be surprised at a lady's undertaking such a role, I must shortly describe to you how it was accomplished. Her voice was probably originally a contralto, but practice has so developed the tone and power of the lower notes de poitrine that they exactly resemble those of the highest and purest tenors, while the upper register as exactly imitates their falsetto. She has not therefore to alter the tenor parts or take them in octaves, but sings them in loco, and the illusion is most perfect. Both voice and style are framed on the model of Rubini. There is the same thrilling, impassioned feeling and touching vibrato. Altogether, I should say, it is quite unique. Josephine Giel's tenor voice, controlled according to Stanford with the best Italian skill, often elicited compliments. Some 20 years previously, she sang through an act of Bellini's Norma with Giuditta Pasta, accompanied by the composer himself. On another occasion, she partnered Jenny Lind before Queen Victoria. The point of interest here, however, is the way Giel conceived the sound of masculinity and how it is described. To repeat, both voice and style are framed on the model of Rubini. There is the same thrilling, impassioned feeling and touching vibrato. This reference to vibrato was one of the first in the history of the musical world since it had begun circulation 17 years previously. As we know, the issue of vibrato in singing is complex. Is it the action of a regular pulsation that does not vary the pitch of the note and which is the inevitable oscillation of a free resonant voice, as claimed by many singers and teachers from Francesco Lamperti in 1864 to Richard Miller in 2004? Or is it, as has been argued since the 1970s, culturally determined learned behavior, a distortion of the straight tone heard in adolescent and untrained voices? These are questions I don't have space to pursue today, although at times they inflect the discussion. Instead, my emphasis here is primarily on the cultural significance of vibrato in 19th and early 20th century Britain, in line with Raymond Williams' theories about the structure of feeling. Williams famously outlined the difficulty historians face in deciphering the felt sense of the quality of life at a particular place and time. That is, how all the different constituent elements of embodied experience combined into a way of thinking and living. Vibrato seems an especially apt example to analyze, given that it is in itself a microcosmic structure of feeling, and yet also formed part of the epoch's broader structures of feeling, in particular how the display of passion was heard, interpreted, and evaluated. The now accepted view is that vibrato as an integral part of vocal tone, instead of being deployed as an occasional instrument, only emerged at the beginning of the 20th century. The periodicals, singing manuals, and other documents of the 19th century paint a rather different picture. While various singers demonstrated a continuous vibrato during the 1820s, 19th century British commentators attributed its increasing influence to the Italian tenor Giovanni Battista Rubini. The most fated tenor of the 1820s and 1830s, Rubini created 5 tenor roles for Bellini, including Arturo in I Puritani, complete with his high F. His voice was sometimes described as a tenor coltratino, supposedly singing in full chest voice up to around middle C, and then in falsetto beyond. Physically unprepossessing, careless of his dress, and not much of an actor, Rubini's strength lay in the degree to which he invested himself in the music. His singing, wrote Henry Chorley, was marked by a passion, a fervour, a putting forth to the utmost of every resource of consummate vocal art and emotion. How was this passion made evident? Many critics claimed that there was a tremble in Rubini's voice, described by some as the sound of tears. A fairly broad selection of commentators testify to this effect: Chopin and Castelblaise in Paris, Chorley and Frederick von Raumer in London, among others. Some attributed this oscillation to Rubini's ardent commitment to the music, others to the effects of vocal decline. Either way, it hardly impeded Rubini's popularity during his frequent appearances in London during the 1830s and 1840s. Indeed, it was regarded as a marker of his vocal authenticity. Nor did vibrato in the voices of singers of the succeeding generation arouse much adverse comment either. Enrico Tambelic was one of the new tenori robusti who employed his chest voice throughout the full extent of his range. In 1852, the musical world commented on his performance in Donizetti's Maria de Rohan for the Royal Italian Opera. Tambelic's voice was in excellent condition, while the richness of his tones, accompanied by that peculiar vibrato which, after some discussion, has been accepted not merely as a peculiarity, but, when under entire control as now, a beauty, gave additional effect to his large and finished style of phrasing, leaving the ear and judgment equally satisfied. A year later, the leader described Tambelic's performance in Guglielmo Tell, again for the Royal Italian Opera. In the finale, Suivez-moi, his magnificent vibrato soared triumphantly over chorus and orchestra. All the difficult high notes in this grand appeal to arms, the despair of every other robust tenor since the time of Dupré, were sung without the slightest appearance of effort, and the famous high C at the end that rang through the theatre was an effect never to be forgotten by those who heard it. Small wonder, then, that the critic of the musical world did not hesitate to praise Josephine Gilles' rendition of Rubini's vibrato less than 2 months later. By 1861, the mood had changed. Writing about Tambelic's performance of the title role of Verdi's Il Trovatore, the London Review complained that it was greatly to be regretted that the otherwise beautiful singing of this great tenor is often destroyed by his incessant vibrato, which at times becomes so strong as to endanger not only his individual success, but that of the opera. So, what happened between 1853 and 1861 to bring about this newly negative perception of vibrato in Britain? There are several possibilities. First, we should note that accusations of vibrato are unreliable evidence. Just 2 examples out of many. In 1843, Donizetti tried to prevent the English soprano Anna Bishop from creating the title role of Caterina Cornaro because she had a pronounced beat in her voice, he said, that sounded like un tamburello, a little drum. That same year, British critics praised her bird-like purity of intonation and unfailing perfection of execution, with not a word about any unsteadiness of tone. Similarly, Gaetano Ferri, an Italian baritone much admired by Verdi in 1846 for his vocal beauty and technical command, was described in Grove's Dictionary in 1883 by Henry Collins Deacon, who'd heard him in Milan in the 1850s, as having such a pronounced tremolo that his whole singing was a bad wobbling trill. Numerous other instances demonstrate that there was as much variation in the reports of vibrato as there was in vibrato's effect on tonal steadiness. Moreover, it often seems to have been heard more acutely in voices from other cultures than that of the listener. To return to Tamberlik, perhaps those comments in 1861 were provoked by vocal deterioration, that what had begun as a thrilling pulsation had become a pronounced and uncontrollable wobble. Yet the reviewer, identifying several phrases Tamberlik sang perfectly without vibrato, claimed that its use was thus a matter of the singer's choice. Maybe, therefore, Tamberlik was singing in much the same way as he always had done. But this critic now heard that aspect of his singing differently and in more negative terms. If so, why? One possibility was Tamberlik's association with Verdi's operas, which had had a hostile reception in London. James Davison of the Times first dismissed Verdi in 1846 as thoroughly insignificant, and then, following the popularity with British audiences of Rigoletto, Il Trovatore and La Traviata in the 1850s, claimed that Verdi writes exclusively for mobs. The London Review's later critique of Tamberlik in Il Trovatore similarly described Verdi's music as vulgar, affected and strained, besides which the music was frequently heard on the barrel organ. Questions had also begun to be raised about the effect of Verdi's music, with its heavier orchestration, declamatory style and heightened intensity in the upper third of the range, on vocal technique, undermining the previous perception of Italian methods as the international gold standard of voice training. One example was a letter by Jenny Lind, in which she advised the student singer not to go to Italy because the current methods, courtesy of Verdi's most dangerous music, she said, required singers to force their voices. Instead, Lind argued, access to the true Italian school was now only available by training in London and Paris. She particularly recommended Garcia, followed by a period spent in Germany, the land of real music. Tensions between northern and southern European approaches to singing became increasingly marked by differences in approaches to vibrato. While anxiety about the effects of the new techniques was echoed by critics in Italy, concerned about vocal health and the tradition of bel canto, the debate in Britain extended beyond purely musical and vocal issues to encompass extra-musical factors such as social class, gender representation, and notions of national identity. An article in the Musical World, this time in 1860, encapsulates many of the key complaints about vibrato. I find one source of congratulation. That is, we are getting rid of the disgusting tremolo that many singers indulged in. It was a French importation, though freely bestowed upon us by some of the Italians, some of whom are so addicted themselves to this voce di capra that they cannot sing a pure note. Signor Ferrari, Adolfo Ferrari, in his excellent singing tutor, says that as the street organs imitate this execrable introduction, it can sink no lower. What is striking here is the extremity of the language. It is difficult to think, is it not, of another stylistic mannerism that could provoke such extraordinary language. The adjective disgusting, perfectly sickening is something I've read on other occasions. The adjective disgusting suggests the listener was physically revolted, and the verbs indulged in and addicted implies that vibrato was the product of singers' lack of moral self-discipline. Attributing its provenance to French and Italian sources, of course, makes vibrato supposedly alien to British styles of singing. Finally, associating vibrato with street performers and barrel organs underscores its innate lack of refinement, and thus its impropriety in the high art domain of opera. so too could it mar the presentation of idealized womanhood. The musical world in 1879 lamented that the pure female voice had degenerated into shaking palsy. Moral outrage again simmered throughout the article. Both professional and amateur singers are castigated for resorting to shallow tricks and meretricious ornaments. The godlike human voice is degraded to the mechanical twitter of a canary bird, and Italian opera, which should be an elevator of the tastes of the people, corrupts it. Late Victorian distaste for vibrato reflected wider suspicions about the display of overt sentiment in both life and art, particularly where it attracted popular response. Where in earlier decades sentiment had played a significant role in humanizing working-class subjects for the wealthier public who so often regarded them as subhuman, now it was associated with emotional excess, falseness or insincerity, and regarded as a marker of aesthetic failure. It was a move that had begun to appear in art criticism in the late 1850s and which soon also found scientific support. 18th century writers such as the philosopher Thomas Reid had regarded tears as a means of revealing the inner soul, a perspective still apparent in the strong manly heroes who freely wept in the literature of the 1840s. In contrast, Charles Darwin's physiological analysis of emotional expression in 1872 labeled tears as mostly incidental and purposeless. Weeping, he wrote, was commonly indulged in by infants, women, and the insane, but largely shunned by British men. Englishmen rarely cry, except under the pressure of the acutest grief, whereas in some parts of the continent the men shed tears much more readily and freely. Intense emotions were increasingly identified as unstable and harmful. Thomas Dixon observes that changing ideas about the role of sentiment in the 1870s also coincided with the formation of the British Empire, marked by the designation of Queen Victoria as Empress of India in 1876. Repression of emotions at home, he argues, was matched by the repression of peoples elsewhere in this new climate of militarism, empire, and warfare. It's perhaps unsurprising that in such contexts, the sound of tears evoked by vibrato should be considered as inappropriate, especially with regard to male singers. By 1883, Deacon's long article on singing in Grove's New Dictionary of Music condemned vibrato and tremolo as mere abominable mannerisms, expressing nothing at all but a direful want of control over the feelings, and there is no greater nuisance in life than cheap tears. Enshrining this view in the most scholarly British music dictionary to date gave it undoubted authority. Vibrato was not merely poor vocal technique, but a shameful loss of emotional restraint that imperiled an orderly society. British distaste for vibrato grew apace. Occasionally, efforts would be made by one or another reviewer to explain that vibrato was not an abuse or a vice, but an incurable malady owing to inadequate training, something to be pitied rather than castigated. But this more rational approach did not gain ground. Articles and letters against vibrato in the British press continued well into the 20th century, with a particular flourishing in the 1920s. The Musical Mirror in 1929 cited one letter to the Times that had demanded why the plague of the vibrato has acquired so strong a hold, and how is the germ to be killed? And given that so many of these letters and articles are anonymous, I am happy to be able to present to you the author of this particular one, Major General Sir Desmond O'Callaghan, a retired artillery officer, die-hard conservative, and stalwart defender of the British Empire. He is everything you can imagine from that picture. On this occasion, the musical mirror at least countered by arguing that vibrato played an important role in expressing emotion, and what it asked, would singing be without emotion? It was a view already apparent in the work of the American psychologist Carl Seashore from the early 1920s. His later summary here perhaps pinpoints the reason why vibrato thrilled some listeners and provoked such unease in others. Beauty in the vibrato is found in artistic deviation from the precise and uniform in all the attributes of tone. The vibrato is the most systematic, natural, and essential of musical ornaments. Its beauty lies in a richness of tone, flexibility of tone, and expression of emotional instability. Yet deviation of any kind from the norm, particularly one that might promote emotional instability or instability of any kind, was of course exactly contrary to the authoritarian and regimented precepts of late Victorian and Edwardian society. In conclusion, the issue of vibrato in 19th and early 20th century Britain was not simply an unmediated or transparent question of vocal technique or even of aesthetic choices. Rather, vibrato's aureole explicit structure of feeling engendered broader anxieties about the expression of emotion within ideas of high and low art, within concepts of morality, where revelation of feeling was associated with loose morals, within desired models of masculinity and femininity, and within strategies of nation building. And where once vibrato had been savoured as a delicious frisson of passion or the sound of tears, by the end of the period, its most vehement detractors heard only a disturbing and yet unstoppable divergence from some of their most cherished principles on which the empire was founded. Unstoppable because, as the niece of Major General Sir Desmond Callaghan pointed out in her own letter to the Times some weeks later, the public not only tolerated vibrato, but actively doted on it. If a threat to the future of the empire could be heard, maybe it lay in that insistent vocal trembling and its defiant championship of the beauties of deviation and difference. Thank you.